she walked into the base, thinking it was just another ordinary visit. But what happened next would change everything. Dana Carver, a retired soldier, wasn't looking for recognition. She wasn't here to make a statement, only to help. But when she stepped up to the counter in her worn, faded uniform, the young admin officer gave her a once-over and shook his head. "You can't wear that here," he said, his voice flat and dismissive. "Not unless you're on active duty." Dana paused. The words stung, but she didn't let it show. She had learned long ago to ignore the judgments people made based on appearances. Her uniform, grayed from years of wear, no longer fitting quite the way it once did, wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a symbol of everything she had endured. But the officer didn't seem to care about that. He didn't know what the faded fabric meant. He didn't understand the history it carried. With a flick of his wrist, he waved her to the side, instructing her to either change or leave. Dana turned away, unfazed, but as she walked toward the door, the back of her shirt lifted slightly, just enough for someone across the room to notice the ink on her back. Numbers etched into her skin. A tattoo, not from a beach parlor, but from a mission that no one in this room would ever forget. The moment the admin officer saw those numbers, everything changed. Dana Carver had been in the military for over 23 years, but today, as she pulled into the parking lot of Fort Ridgeline, it felt like she was stepping into a life she no longer recognized. The air was thick with the familiar scent of dust and diesel, a cocktail every soldier had memorized over the years. The sun had barely crested the horizon, casting long shadows over the base as the sound of boots on concrete filled the still morning air. The distant hum of generators mixed with the steady rumble of supply trucks moving past the guardhouse, a symphony of military efficiency that never truly stopped. She parked her weathered Tacoma in the half-empty lot, the engine cutting off with a soft sputter. Dana sat there for a moment, her hands still on the wheel, taking in the view of the base she hadn't seen in years. The track field stretched out before her, already populated by a group of young recruits preparing for their morning evaluation. Some of them were stretching, others were fidgeting nervously with their boots, checking their laces as they mentally prepared for the challenges ahead. She glanced at her reflection in the rear-view mirror. The face that stared back was older than she remembered. Lines around her eyes, a few streaks of gray weaving through her brown hair. She looked older than her 46 years, but her posture was still as straight as it had ever been. Her hands, though a little more weathered, were still steady. Dana exhaled, pushing open the truck door with a deliberate motion. She moved slowly, methodically, as she always did, each step calculated, each movement precise. She wore a faded Army PT shirt, its gray fabric soft from countless washes, paired with black shorts that had seen better days. The uniform, though worn, still held a ghost of the soldier she once was. The nameplate had long since worn away, leaving only faint impressions in the fabric where Carver had been stitched in black thread. Her dog tags, however, still hung around her neck, resting just beneath the collar. They had never left her since the day she first put them on over 2 decades ago. There was no reason to take them off. They had become a part of her, just as the uniform had, symbols of her past, her service, and everything she had sacrificed. Dana wasn't here to relive the past. She wasn't here to bask in the memories of her glory days. The truth was, she had missed the military, the structure, the purpose, the camaraderie. It was a life that, no matter how much she tried to distance herself from it, still held a pull on her heart. There were days when she felt the absence of it like a weight that settled deep in her chest. But today wasn't about nostalgia. Dana was here for a purpose. 3 weeks ago, she had received a call from Sergeant Major Dean, a voice roughened by age and too many desert deployments. He asked if she could help pace the female recruits during their annual evaluation. The way he spoke to her, urgent, but not desperate, told her everything she needed to know. He didn't need just another trainer. He needed someone who had been there, someone who understood what it meant to push through when everything felt like it was falling apart. Need someone who knows what it means to push through, he had said. Someone who's been there. Dana didn't hesitate. She said yes before he finished asking, not because she missed the army, though there were days when she did, but because she remembered being 19 and terrified. She remembered running beside women who had already proven themselves, watching them push through when the odds were stacked against them, learning from them what true strength looked like. Not the kind of strength that could be flexed for an audience, but the kind that was quiet, steady, and unwavering. As she grabbed her duffel bag from the truck and slung it over her shoulder, Dana took one last look at the parking lot, where a few government vehicles sat near the admin building. The base had changed over the years, new buildings had been added, old ones repurposed, but some things remained the same. The air still tasted like dust, and the sound of boots on concrete still had the power to stir memories. Dana checked her gear one last time. Water bottle, car keys, and the folded authorization papers she had received a few days earlier. She glanced at the crumpled photograph in her bag. It was from 2000, showing 5 soldiers grinning at the camera. The base in the background was no longer standing, but the faces in the photo would always remain frozen in time. 4 of those faces would never age past that moment. She pushed the door open and entered the admin building. The cold air hit her immediately, the artificial chill of the air conditioning making her skin prickle after the heat of the desert outside. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the beige walls covered in safety posters and duty rosters. The floor was that dull linoleum that every government building seemed to have, polished from decades of boots shuffling across it. Behind the counter, a young specialist named Morrison looked up from his computer screen. His expression was a mix of boredom and mild curiosity, the kind of look that people had when they had been stuck in a routine job for too long. His nameplate read SBC Morrison J. in crisp block letters. He looked her up and down, and for a moment, Dana wondered if he recognized her. But he didn't say anything about it. "Morning, ma'am. How can I help you?" he asked, his tone distant. Dana approached the counter with quiet confidence, her boots making soft sounds on the polished floor. She pulled the folded papers from her jacket pocket and handed them to him. The documents were carefully creased, precise and deliberate, just like everything Dana did. "Dana Carver," she said. "I'm here for the training support. Should be on your volunteer roster." Morrison took the papers, scanning them quickly, his gaze shifting from the screen to the documents, then back to Dana. She could see his mind working, unsure whether to ask questions or just process the request. "I see you're on the list," he said, tapping the screen lightly. "But I don't think that uniform is authorized unless you're currently assigned to the base." The words hit Dana like a cold gust of wind, but she didn't flinch. She had been through far worse than this. She'd learned long ago to ignore the whispers, the glances, the judgments from people who didn't know her story. Dana waited. The fluorescent lights above hummed in a sterile, almost mechanical rhythm, and the soft murmurs of staff in the background created a hum of white noise. She could hear the footsteps of other soldiers, the shuffle of boots on the polished linoleum floor. Through the windows, she could see the recruits outside, stretching in preparation for their morning run. Their young, eager faces were a contrast to her own, a reminder of a time when she too had stood in their shoes, full of nervous energy and ambition. Morrison was still staring at the screen, scanning the roster with a distracted air, seemingly unaware of the tension that was slowly building in the room. Dana's gaze drifted to the bulletin board behind him, cluttered with duty rosters, training schedules, and outdated safety posters. The cold air from the AC pressed against her skin, making the heat outside feel like a distant memory. It wasn't long before Morrison looked up from his screen, his face creased with mild confusion. "I'm showing AD Carver on the list," he said, his voice trailing off as he looked from the papers in his hand to Dana's worn PT uniform. But, he paused, a slight furrow creasing his brow. I don't think that uniform is authorized unless you're actively assigned to the base. Dana's heart sank. She had expected this, knew it was coming. It had been too long since she'd been part of the active duty army. But the sting of the remark still burned. There was no malice in Morrison's voice, but his words cut just the same. He didn't understand. None of them did. The woman behind Morrison, a middle-aged civilian with tired eyes, overheard the exchange. She glanced over with a dismissive look, her voice louder than necessary. "Policy's pretty clear on that," she said, not bothering to lower her voice. "You can't have civilians wandering around in uniform pieces just because they used to serve. It's against regulation." Dana felt the weight of the woman's words, but she didn't react. There was no need to. She had been through this before. Too many times in too many places. The cold stares, the judgment, the quiet ridicule. Soldiers, retirees, and civilians alike often assumed she was clinging to a life she could never return to. They didn't understand what the uniform represented. They couldn't possibly know what it cost her to wear it, even for a moment. She remained still, her posture straight, her expression neutral. She had learned to wear this face, stoic, calm, unreadable. Morrison looked up again, seeming to take in her entire presence for the first time. His eyes flicked to her uniform once more, then to her dog tags, still visible beneath the collar. She could tell he was trying to figure it out, trying to make sense of the woman in front of him. It wasn't that he didn't respect her. It was just that he didn't know her. He hadn't been there. "I'll need to check with my supervisor," he said, his voice more resigned than apologetic. Dana simply nodded, her fingers brushing the worn fabric of her PT shirt as she stood there waiting. There was a part of her that wanted to argue, to fight back against the assumption that she was some relic of the past. But that part of her had been buried long ago. What was the point? What good would it do to explain? As Morrison disappeared into the back office, Dana glanced out the window once more. The recruits outside had started their warm-up stretches, their youthful energy filling the air. Some of them were nervously checking their laces, while others seemed more relaxed, ready for the physical challenge ahead. Their voices carried on the dry desert wind, an echo of her own past. She remembered the nerves, the fear, and the uncertainty of being tested, of standing in front of someone and hoping to measure up. But the longer she stood there, the more her mind wandered. Dana had spent more than 2 decades in the military, rising through the ranks from a young, unsure recruit to a seasoned soldier who had earned every scar, every battle, and every medal. But the army had a way of forgetting you once you were no longer in the game. The uniform, though faded and worn, was the only piece of her history that still held meaning. It wasn't just a piece of clothing. It was a symbol of survival, a reminder of the missions, the sacrifices, and the camaraderie that had defined her life for so many years. It was a piece of her soul, her identity, and to have it questioned, dismissed, was a blow she hadn't expected. Minutes ticked by, the silence between her and the office growing thick. Her eyes followed the recruits outside, watching their movements, their awkwardness, their strength in numbers. They were all still learning. Dana had long since learned the lessons that military life taught. But the hardest lessons, those that came in the heat of battle, under the weight of impossible decisions, were the ones that stayed with you forever. She could hear Morrison's voice in the other room, speaking with someone. His words were muffled, but she could make out the occasional fragment. He was speaking to someone of authority now, no doubt trying to figure out what to do about the woman standing before him. A sudden movement in the hallway caught her attention. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez walked past the open door, clipboard tucked under his arm. Dana recognized him instantly. He was the kind of guy who had seen more than his share of the real world. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp, but when he stopped in his tracks and looked at her back, his expression changed. his gaze fixed on the tattoo on the back of her shirt, the one that had only become visible when she had shifted slightly. 3 numbers, sharp and precise, etched into her skin like a mark of honor. The ink had faded over the years, but the numbers, 1375, were still as sharp as the day they had been carved. Rodriguez froze. His clipboard slipped from his fingers, falling to the ground with a soft clatter. He didn't pick it up. His eyes stayed locked on her tattoo, his face going pale. Dana saw it, but she didn't react. Rodriguez knew. He recognized those numbers. They weren't just any random sequence. They belonged to Detachment 1375, Night Owl Group, a unit that had been erased from history, a unit whose story had never made the headlines, whose achievements were never celebrated. But Rodriguez knew. He had read the reports, the ones buried deep within classified files. He knew the story of how Detachment 1375 had held the Northern Gate route when everything had gone to hell. How they had fought alone for 43 minutes, saving a NATO convoy without backup, without resupply. He knew the cost. He knew the price of their sacrifice. But instead of speaking, instead of acknowledging the weight of the moment, Rodriguez turned and hurried down the hall. His clipboard forgotten, his mind racing. Dana watched him go. She didn't flinch, didn't move. She didn't need to. The minutes seemed to stretch on forever as Dana stood still in the sterile waiting area, feeling the weight of the moment settle in her chest. It wasn't the first time she had been questioned about her uniform, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But today, for some reason, it hit harder. The sharp sting of judgment mixed with a growing ache in her chest. A reminder that no matter how many years had passed, she was still defined by what she had been, not who she had become. The uniform wasn't just fabric. It was everything. As she waited, the memories began to flood her mind. Moments from a past that was never truly gone. They came unbidden, like waves crashing against a shore, each one carrying a lesson learned the hard way. Dana had spent 23 years in the military, but it had only taken a few moments to reshape her entire life. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, trying to push away the memories that threatened to overwhelm her. The day she first enlisted was still vivid in her mind. She was barely 18, just a kid trying to figure out who she was in the world. But the Army had a way of shaping people. It didn't care about your past. It only cared about what you could contribute to the mission, what you could bring to the table. For Dana, the Army became her family, her purpose, her identity. It was early in her training when she first noticed the differences between herself and some of the other recruits. The other women were faster, stronger, more confident. Dana struggled to keep up, to prove herself. But she didn't back down. There was a fire in her that couldn't be extinguished. She pushed through the pain, the exhaustion, the self-doubt. The drills, the tests, they all blurred together in her memory, each one a small victory that led to the next. And with each passing day, she grew stronger. But it wasn't until her first deployment that Dana truly understood what it meant to serve. The mission was supposed to be simple: secure a route for a convoy. Easy enough. But when things went sideways, when the dust settled and the smoke cleared, Dana found herself in the thick of it, holding her ground in a situation that should have been impossible. It was the Northern Gate, a critical position, but one that had become a weak point in their defense. Dana and her team had been tasked with holding it, but when the attack came, it came fast and furious. Their backup never arrived. Their resupply didn't come through. For 43 minutes, they held the line, fighting alone against overwhelming odds. Dana's hands still shook when she remembered the sounds of gunfire, the adrenaline that had surged through her veins, and the faces of the soldiers around her. Faces that were already beginning to blur in her memory, but whose presence still haunted her every night. They had saved a NATO convoy that day, but at a cost. 4 of her teammates would never make it back. The unit was disbanded, erased from the official records because of what they had done. They had gone off the books, too classified to acknowledge, too dangerous to remember. The only thing that remained of their mission was the tattoo Dana had gotten on the back of her neck. 3 numbers, 13, 7, and 5. They had been burned into her skin in a makeshift clinic in the middle of a desert, a silent tribute to those who had fought beside her. The tattoo wasn't meant to be a badge of honor. It was a reminder that some stories weren't meant to be told, that some sacrifices were too great to be acknowledged by anyone except those who had been there. But even after everything, Dana carried it with her. It wasn't just a symbol of a mission. It was the memory of her fallen comrades, the weight of their loss, and the knowledge that she had been one of the lucky ones. She had made it back, and while she could still feel the heat of the battle in her bones, she knew she was different now. The uniform, the tattoo, they were all she had left to show for it. Dana's eyes flickered open, the silence of the admin building pulling her back to the present. Morrison was back at the counter, and this time, he wasn't alone. The door opened, and in walked a man whose presence commanded attention without a single word. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with an effortless confidence that spoke of years of experience. His uniform was sharp, but there were signs of age in his face. Lines etched by the kind of hardship that only comes with time spent in the field. Lieutenant Kalin was clearly out of his depth, his posture stiff and uncertain as he followed the older officer into the room. The difference between them was obvious. Kalin's youthful, untested confidence and the veteran's quiet authority. Dana could see the tension in Kalin's shoulders, the way he tried to mask his discomfort behind a polite smile. The older officer, Colonel Ford, looked directly at Dana, his gaze unwavering. For a brief moment, she thought she saw something in his eyes. Recognition, understanding, but it was gone in the blink of an eye, replaced by the professional mask of a commanding officer. He extended his hand, the gesture as formal as it was respectful. "Sergeant Carver," he said, his voice low but strong, "I understand there's some confusion about your participation today. Can you explain why you're here in that uniform?" Dana took his hand firmly, her grip strong and sure, betraying nothing of the turmoil that simmered beneath the surface. "I'm here to help with the training," she replied, her voice steady. But there was a note of quiet authority in it. "Sergeant Major Dean asked for me to pace the female recruits. I'm cleared to assist." Colonel Ford's eyes flicked to the papers Morrison had handed him, scanning the details. He was calm, deliberate, every movement calculated, every word carefully chosen. It was clear he was processing the information, but he didn't rush to judgment. Instead, he turned his attention back to Dana. "You're retired, correct?" he asked, his tone neutral. "That's correct, sir." Ford nodded, then glanced at Kalin. The younger officer, still standing by the counter, looked uncomfortable, his gaze flicking between Dana and his superior. Ford held up a hand, dismissing him without a word. Kalin took a step back, clearly eager to defer to the more experienced officer. "Sergeant Carver," Ford said, his voice quieter now, "there are rules about uniform wear on this base. The PT uniform is meant for active duty personnel. I'm afraid you're going to have to change." His words were firm but not unkind. Dana didn't flinch. She had heard this before, many times. The rules were black and white. But she wasn't just any soldier. She wasn't someone who could be dismissed so easily. She was more than just the faded uniform. She was the quiet strength, the resilience that came from years of service. And Ford, though he hadn't known her history, recognized something in her that Kalin hadn't. The silent respect for what she had been, for what she had sacrificed. The room was silent for a moment, the only sound being the soft hum of the fluorescent lights above. Dana stood there, her eyes fixed on Colonel Ford, waiting for him to speak. The tension in the air was palpable, the unspoken question hanging between them. What would happen next? The entire situation had unfolded so quickly, and yet Dana felt like she had been standing here for hours, her heart pounding with a quiet but determined rhythm. She knew she wasn't going to back down. Not now. Ford studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. He had already seen the worn fabric of her uniform, the faded patches, and the dog tags that hung around her neck, but he hadn't yet seen the most important part. The mark of a history that had been erased from the books, hidden from everyone but the people who had been there. The tattoo on her back, the one that told a story no one else knew, was the key to everything. "I'm afraid we'll have to ask you to leave if you can't comply with the uniform regulations," Ford said, his voice still calm, though there was a slight edge to it now. The younger officer, Kalen, stepped forward, clearly eager to bring this matter to a close. He glanced nervously between Dana and Ford, but it was clear that this situation was quickly escalating beyond his control. Dana didn't move. She wasn't going to argue. There was no point in defending herself, in explaining what the uniform meant, what she had been through. There was no reason to fight a system that wasn't designed to understand her story. But she wasn't going to walk away quietly either. As she shifted slightly, her worn PT shirt lifted just enough for the light to catch the edge of the tattoo on her back. The numbers 1375, etched into her skin like a permanent mark, faded but sharp, stared back at them, revealing a part of her history that no one could deny. It wasn't just ink. It was a reminder, a testament to what had been sacrificed in the name of duty. The shift in the room was instantaneous. Ford's eyes locked onto the tattoo, and for the first time, his mask of authority faltered. Kalen didn't notice immediately, but the moment Ford's gaze fixed on the numbers, Dana could feel the change in the air. The officer's posture shifted, his stance relaxing slightly, as though he were processing something important, something that had suddenly clicked in his mind. "Those numbers," Ford said quietly, almost as if to himself. His voice was laced with a recognition that Dana had long since grown accustomed to, though she hadn't expected to hear, in this sterile admin office. "That tattoo? It's from Detachment 1375, isn't it?" The name fell from his lips like a whisper, as if he hadn't meant to say it out loud. But Dana heard it clearly. Detachment 1375. Night Owl Group. The unit that had been erased from history. The unit whose mission had never been acknowledged, whose heroics were buried under layers of classified files, redacted reports, and whispered rumors. Dana hadn't expected anyone here to know. But Ford knew. Kalen, still oblivious to the significance of the moment, looked at Ford with confusion in his eyes. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice almost hesitant. Ford didn't answer him immediately. His eyes remained locked on the tattoo, his mind racing as the pieces fell into place. For Dana, it was as if the entire world slowed down. She could feel the weight of the memories pressing down on her chest, the ghosts of those who had been lost, the men and women who had fought beside her, their names erased from the record, their faces fading with time. But they hadn't disappeared completely. They were here, in this moment, in the form of those 3 numbers etched into her skin. Ford's voice broke through her reverie, low and steady. "Detachment 1375, he repeated, his tone now commanding. "Night Owl Group, the unit that saved a NATO convoy under impossible circumstances." He turned to Kalen, his voice firm, his words laced with authority. "You don't know about them, do you?" Kalen shook his head, his confusion deepening. "I know, sir. I haven't heard of them." Ford's gaze flicked back to Dana. There was a shift in his eyes now, a change that spoke volumes. He had recognized the tattoo, recognized the sacrifice that came with it. He had seen enough in his own time in service to understand the significance of what Dana carried with her. "The Northern Gate," Ford said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of history. "You were there, weren't you? Holding that position when everything went to hell." Dana didn't answer immediately. She didn't need to. Ford knew. And somehow, that knowledge made all the difference. The silent understanding between them was enough. She had held the line that day. When the odds were stacked against them, she had kept fighting when everyone else had fallen back. When the rest of the world had turned away, she had held the flank, saving lives, knowing the cost of every second, every shot fired. Ford took a step closer, his eyes still locked on her tattoo, his voice quiet but filled with reverence. "You pulled my brother out after the second IED," he said. "He was in the lead truck. You kept the flank covered when the rest of the unit fell back. You saved his life." Dana's breath caught in her chest, her heart skipping a beat as Ford's words washed over her. She hadn't known it was his brother. She hadn't known who she was saving that day. She hadn't known that her actions had been the difference between life and death for someone who mattered. But now, in this quiet, unexpected moment, she understood. Ford's face softened, the hardness that had been present in his expression dissipating. He took another step forward, lowering his voice to something more intimate, as though he were sharing a secret. "My brother made it home because of you," he said quietly. "He lived another 16 years, got married, had kids. He passed away peacefully last winter." The words hit Dana like a wave, but she didn't let them overwhelm her. She simply nodded, her jaw tightening as she processed the weight of what Ford had said. She had saved a life that day, but she had never expected to be thanked, never expected to know the outcome. "That's good," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ford's hand came up, moving sharply in a formal salute. Dana didn't flinch. She stood tall, meeting his gaze as the base commander held the salute for longer than regulation required. It wasn't just a gesture. It was an acknowledgement. It was respect. "If Sergeant Carver wants to wear that uniform, she wears it," Ford said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "If she wants to support our training, she supports it. And if anyone has a problem with that, they can come explain it to me personally." With that, Ford dropped his salute and turned, his voice now carrying across the room. He wasn't just addressing Dana. He was addressing the entire base, everyone who had ever dismissed her, who had ever looked at her and questioned her right to be there. The tension in the room melted away, replaced by a profound silence. The air felt different now. Dana could feel the weight of the recognition settle around her, but she didn't let it show. Ford turned back to Dana, his expression now softened, his tone warmer. "If you'll walk with me, Sergeant, I'd like to make this right." Dana nodded, shouldering her duffel with practiced ease. She didn't need to say anything more. The message had been made clear. Dana walked alongside Colonel Ford, the sound of her boots on the concrete echoing softly in the empty hallway. The tension that had once hung in the air now seemed to dissipate, replaced by a quiet sense of respect that seemed to settle between them. For the first time since stepping onto the base, Dana felt like she was being seen, not as an outsider, not as a relic of a past long gone, but as a person who had earned her place. The door to Ford's office opened with a soft click, and they entered together. The air inside was cool, the blinds drawn tightly against the harsh desert sun. Ford walked to his desk, pulling up a series of documents on his computer screen. Dana stood quietly, her duffel bag still slung over her shoulder, her posture straight and firm. "Here," Ford said, pulling a piece of paper from the printer and handing it to Dana. "This should clear everything up. Your service verification, Sergeant Carver. Special clearance for training support activities, valid through the end of the quarter." Dana took the document, her fingers brushing against the paper. It was official, stamped with a kind of authority that only someone at Ford's level could wield. The kind of authority that could make or break a soldier's career. But she wasn't concerned with the paperwork. It wasn't about the official clearance. It was about the recognition. She folded the document neatly and tucked it into her duffel, offering Ford a brief nod. "Appreciate it, sir." Ford stood from his desk and walked toward the door, pausing to glance at her. "I'll make sure the base understands that you're here on official business," he said. "And if anyone questions your right to be here again, they'll answer to me." His voice was steady, his tone resolute. Dana didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Ford had already said everything that needed to be said. The respect she had longed for had been given, not in the form of grand speeches or applause, but in the quiet acknowledgement of her past and the quiet recognition of her strength. As they left the office, they passed the same staffers who had once questioned Dana's presence. They had noticed the shift in Ford's demeanor, the respect in his voice, and they knew better than to challenge it. No one spoke as Dana, and Ford walked down the hallway. The atmosphere had changed entirely, the weight of the moment settling over the base like a fog. They arrived at the track field, where the recruits were now gathering in formation. Dana could hear their voices as they prepared for the evaluation, the nervous energy palpable in the air. Ford addressed the training NCO overseeing the formation, his voice carrying across the field. "Sergeant Carver will be pacing today's run," Ford announced. "She's cleared for whatever uniform components she's wearing. Effective immediately." The NCO nodded sharply. "Yes, sir." Dana felt a sense of calm wash over her. It wasn't about the uniform anymore. It wasn't about the rules or the regulations. It was about what she had done, and what she could still do. The recruits were watching now, their curious eyes fixed on her as she stood at the edge of the track, ready to begin. Without a word, Dana dropped her duffel by the bleachers and stretched. The familiar motions were automatic now, her muscles warm, her body ready. When the formation started moving, she didn't just keep pace, she set it. Her stride was smooth, controlled, and purposeful. The younger soldiers found themselves struggling to keep up. Her breathing remained steady, while theirs began to labor under the heat of the sun. By the time the first lap ended, no one was questioning her presence on the track. They were trying to learn from it. As the recruits dispersed toward the barracks, still catching their breath from the run, Dana sat on the concrete steps outside the motor pool. The desert sun was higher now, casting everything in hues of brass and amber, the heat shimmering off the asphalt. The base had settled into its midday rhythm, and Dana, for the first time today, felt at peace. She had done what she came to do, not just pace the run, but prove something far more important. That strength wasn't measured by what you wore or the rules you followed. It was measured by what you carried inside. The quiet resilience, the sacrifices made, and the quiet strength needed to keep moving, even when the world around you didn't understand. A young private approached hesitantly, clutching a water bottle, her boots still shining, her uniform crisp. She looked at Dana with a mix of curiosity and awe, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, were you really with Night Owl?" she asked, her eyes wide with reverence. Dana's gaze softened. She looked at the young recruit, her face still flushed from the run, full of questions and unspoken wonder. Dana didn't need to speak at length. The story wasn't for everyone to know. Some stories were meant to stay untold. "Not alone," Dana replied quietly. "But we did what we had to do. We made it count." The recruit stood there for a moment, processing the weight of her words. She nodded, respect shining in her eyes. Dana rose, brushing the dust from her hands, ready to leave the base. As she walked away, the whispers of the recruits, now understanding what quiet strength truly meant, followed her. In the distance, the sun continued to climb, painting the world in shades of gold.